It's really an honor to be part of this distinguished panel. I have to say, I never imagined being on a panel with Professor Kahneman and Sharon Stone, particularly at the same time. But that, of course, is the charm of the Perez Conference. It's as rich and diverse and fertile as the mind of the man who convenes it. Now, I've been asked to briefly reflect on leadership, which is a daunting task when speaking at a gathering named for such a principled, consequential, and durable leader. And of course, leadership can take many forms. There is leadership by moral example, a Nelson Mandela, a Martin Luther King, whose personal sacrifices changed the course of history. Leadership can be inspired by personal trial, and on this I can testify myself. After my daughter, Lauren, was devastated by intractable epilepsy, for which doctors had no answers, my wife, Susan, launched a research foundation, Citizens United for Research in Epilepsy. 15 years later, CURE is internationally known and recognized as the leading private funder of epilepsy research, including many research grants right here in Israel. So out of grief came leadership and progress. You can lead through excellence in your field, in the arts and science and business. You can lead through philanthropy, and I know this room is filled with leaders. There are many ways to show leadership and bring about meaningful change. But today I want to speak about political leadership and what I've learned over a lifetime in and around a vibrant, competitive democracy. First, let me say that what leadership is not. Success in winning elections is not, to me, a great measure of leadership, and I say that as one who spent most of his life trying to help people win elections. Yes, you have to win in order to govern and affect change, and fashioning a winning campaign requires some leadership skills, but if winning and preservation in office are your main objectives, then you become more of a follower than a leader, a slave to public opinion instead of a shaper of public opinion. You become risk-averse, satisfied to take the path of least resistance. Maintaining your public position eclipses your ability to achieve anything particularly meaningful in that position. That's not leadership. Now, I confess to have been part of a burgeoning industry that provides to candidates and office holders voluminous insights into what voters feel, what they want, what they think, and those tools become more sophisticated every day. And they're seductive to the ambitious politician. They are the keys to the palace. They are the key to electoral success. So the world of politics divides itself into two categories. The most numerous cohort is made up of those who want to be something, and a smaller but more significant cohort that is composed of those who want to do something and are willing to take their own ambitions, to risk their own ambitions for the larger goal of progress. To me, that is political leadership. To fill that role, one has to first have a clear vision of where he or she wants to lead. The leader has to effectively sell that vision in order to achieve it, and as Professor Kahneman would attest, that exercise involves more than simply making a sound, rational argument. It involves effective appeals to shared values and emotions. The leader also has to be practical enough to understand that rarely, if ever, do you achieve everything you had hoped. That progress in democracy almost always involves compromise, principled compromise, and such compromises are certain to displease not just your opponents, but also your allies. Such battles are discomforting to the typical politician, but the willingness to wage them, to me, is the measure of true political leadership. I had a chance to hone my views on leadership and its requirements during 2 very challenging years in the White House, working 20 feet from the Oval Office. I learned a lot about it from my friend and client, President Obama. As you know, he came to office in tumultuous times, 2 wars, an ongoing battle with terrorism, and the deepest economic crisis since the Great Depression. The economic crisis required him to make a series of decisions, each of which was as unpopular as they were necessary. One was an expensive Recovery Act, he sought immediately to reverse the free fall of our economy, which had just experienced its worst quarter since 1930. But coming at a time of already historic deficits, the additional spending, vital as it was an easy target. He had to shore up the fragile financial system, which had locked up and was on the verge of collapse. This required a large temporary investment of public funds in the banks and financial institutions, which were wildly unpopular across the board, but particularly with the rank and file of the president's own party. Many Americans blame the excesses of Wall Street for the collapse of the economy and bitterly resented the bailout of the banks, which they viewed as a reward for greed and irresponsibility. The president also had to intervene to prevent the collapse of the American auto industry by investing public money in two of the largest U.S. Automakers. Most Americans felt that it was the auto executives, through their own poor decision-making over the decades, who had sealed their fate. And they said, why should taxpayers throw them a lifeline? And I remember very clearly briefing the president on polling that reflected this deep public aversion to an auto bailout, even in states like Michigan, which is the birthplace of the American auto industry. And he was polite but dismissive. He said, I understand why people feel the way they do. He said, but we're in the middle of an economic crisis. If we don't act, these companies will fail and 1 million more people will lose their jobs. He said, so if we can use the money to prod them to rationalize their businesses and build cars that people actually want to buy in the 21st century, and they can make a go of it, we have to give it a shot. So I always say about Obama that I admire him so much because he listens to me so little. But that is leadership. Now, in the case of the auto bailout, the president was ultimately rewarded politically in the next election because the revival of the industry he helped spark was important in the pivotal state of Ohio, where 1 in 8 jobs relies on autos. That initial Recovery Act remains the object of mixed affections in the U.S., and the bank bailout still is highly unpopular, despite the fact that almost all the money loaned to the financial industry has been recovered. Overall, you could argue that these early difficult steps he took contributed to the president's reelection by improving the economy to the point that it was not a fatal weight on his chances, but that wasn't clear at the time, not at all. He simply felt it was the right thing to do. He felt he had a duty to act. So often, the leader's accomplishments are not fully appreciated until history has its say. Today, Americans remember Harry Truman as a strong and effective leader for a variety of achievements, not the least of which was his quick and courageous decision to overrule his cautious diplomats and recognize the state of Israel. It's hard now from the vantage point in which we sit to remember that Truman left office in 1953 with some of the worst poll numbers of any retiring incumbent. The leader is willing to take that risk in order to achieve larger goals. One of the proudest decisions President Obama made remains one of his most controversial, and that's the decision, even in the midst of the financial crisis, to pursue large-scale systemic health reform and universal coverage in the United States. This had been an issue in the U.S. for 65 years since Truman tried to accomplish it. Presidents of both parties had failed. To his credit, President Clinton, from whom you heard yesterday, took up the issue and suffered a stinging defeat. So I can assure you that President Obama's political advisors were more than a little concerned about the impact of such a battle and his prospects for succeeding where so many others had failed. Nor did he have to take it up. Unlike the early economic decisions which demanded immediate action, he could have temporized on health care and left it for future presidents. And some argued that the economic crisis gave him the cover to do just that. But he had a different view. He was appalled by the plight of 42 million Americans who were uninsured, and that number was sure to grow. He was alarmed by the exploding cost of health care and was determined to promote best practices, transparency, and competition to hold down the runaway costs and improve health care. He told us, it was a moment that I will always remember. He said, are we going to just sit here and look at our poll numbers, put them on the shelf and admire them? Or are we going to draw down on that capital and try and do something good for this country in the long term. And he says at current course and speed, healthcare is going to go bankrupt, more families are going to go, healthcare is going to bankrupt more families, more businesses, and the government. And if we don't deal with it now, we won't get it done. We can't wait. Health reform almost died 1,000 deaths during the 9 months that we debated it. It survived only because of the determination of a leader who was willing to put his own political neck on the line for the vision of a better future. And as we enter this momentous season for health reform in the U.S., because some of the major steps are about to happen, it's still not popular. The execution of it will be fraught with bumps in the road. The program is built on our existing private healthcare system, rather than, we did that rather than replacing it with a single-payer system of the sort common to Israel and many other developing nations. That was what was possible. This was a disappointment to some of the president's party who criticized him from the left, even as he was flayed from the right for his big government solution. Such is the lot of the leader. But as mixed as the politics is today, I'm absolutely certain that history will look back on the decision as a momentous and positive development in U.S. social and economic history. Even if he had failed in that effort, the president's willingness to brook challenging politics, to work for something of enduring value for our country, is the mark of a leader. And by those standards, the man under whose auspices we gather today is in every sense a world-class leader. Shimon Peres is a visionary who has put Israel's long-term success ahead of short-term politics and his own political fortunes. He is a great leader, and that's why it's such an honor to be here today with him. I'm so happy to have this invitation to be on this wonderful panel. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.